My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside companies rather than being the face of anything. I'm not the loud one in the room. I'm not the person who dominates conversations or turns meetings into performances. I've always been the person people rely on, quietly, consistently, and often without thinking much about it. If you asked my coworkers back then to describe me, they'd probably say I was dependable, calm, low maintenance, someone who just gets things done. What they wouldn't say is that I had influence or ambition or leverage. Not because I lacked those things, but because I never advertised them. I didn't feel the need to. For a long time, I believed that if you showed up every day, did the work well, and stayed loyal, things would balance out on their own. That respect was something you earned slowly, invisibly, like interest compounding in the background. This story is about what happens when that belief meets reality. I want to be clear from the beginning. This isn't a revenge story. There's no dramatic blow-up, no public humiliation, no moment where I stand up and deliver a perfectly crafted speech while everyone goes silent. If that's what you're looking for, this won't give it to you. What this story does offer is honesty. At one point, I saved the company I worked for over $300,000. Not hypothetically, not on paper. Real money. Real risk avoided. I didn't do it to look good. I did it because it was the right thing to do and because I genuinely cared about the place I worked. What I got in return wasn't praise. It wasn't even a quiet appreciation. It was a formal warning. That moment didn't explode my emotions. It didn't make me angry or bitter. What it did was much more dangerous. It changed the way I saw everything. It forced me to recognize a pattern I'd been rationalizing for years, a pattern where loyalty was expected, silence was rewarded with more responsibility, and value was acknowledged only when it was convenient. This story is about that realization and what followed after. Over the next parts, I'll take you through who I was inside that company, how small moments of dismissal became routine, how I convinced myself that staying quiet was maturity, and how a single internal shift changed the way I moved. I'll talk about what I noticed, what I documented, and how I made decisions without raising my voice or breaking my moral code. There's no villain monologue in this story, no cartoon bad guys, just people operating within a system that quietly teaches you what it values and what it doesn't. I didn't stop being loyal because I became cold. I stopped because I finally understood what my loyalty was costing me. I'm not telling this to tell you what to do. I'm telling it because stories like this are happening everywhere, often to people who don't even realize the turning point has already passed. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever stayed loyal to something long after it stopped being loyal to you, simply because you believed that was who you were? Inside the company, I wasn't invisible, but I was close enough that it didn't matter when I was. I had a desk near the operations floor, not tucked away, not central either. People walked past me constantly. They greeted me, nodded, and sometimes asked quick questions. I was known, just not considered. To most people, I was steady Ethan, the guy who didn't panic when something broke, the one you looped in when a process stalled or numbers didn't line up. I was dependable in a way that made others comfortable delegating risk downward. If something needed fixing quietly, it found its way to me. But no one ever said, "Let's hear what Ethan thinks," when decisions were being made upstream. In meetings, I spoke only when I was certain my input mattered. When I did, it was usually to clarify something technical or to point out a constraint no one had noticed yet. I didn't dramatize problems. I translated them. That habit earned me a reputation for being practical, which is a polite way of saying non-threatening. I didn't fight for visibility. Part of that was personality. I've never enjoyed competing for attention, but part of it was belief. I genuinely thought the work would speak for itself, that if I kept things running smoothly, someone, somewhere, would notice the absence of chaos and trace it back to me. That belief kept me patient. My managers liked me because I didn't push back emotionally. When deadlines shifted or priorities changed midweek, I adjusted. When someone else missed something critical, I corrected it without looping in leadership. I told myself I was protecting the team. In reality, I was protecting the image of a system that depended on quiet corrections to function. I wasn't the guy they worried about losing. And because of that, I became the guy they leaned on hardest. I took on work that wasn't formally assigned to me, not out of martyrdom, but because I saw gaps that could turn into problems. I created documentation no one asked for. I built small internal tools that saved hours each week. I optimized processes that had been inefficient for years, not because it would earn me anything, but because inefficiency bothered me. I thought that made me valuable. What I didn't understand yet was the difference between being useful and being valued. When performance reviews came around, my feedback was always positive and vague. Consistent, reliable, a strong support presence. There was never urgency in how I was discussed, no sense of trajectory. I wasn't being groomed or sidelined, I was being parked. At the time, I told myself that was fine. I wasn't chasing titles. I didn't need constant affirmation. I prided myself on being emotionally independent from corporate validation. I thought that made me mature. But looking back, I can see how that mindset made me easy to categorize. Ethan doesn't complain. Ethan doesn't escalate. Ethan will handle it. Once you get placed in that mental box, people stop checking whether you're okay with what's being handed to you. They assume consent because you've never revoked it. What's important to understand is this: nothing felt overtly wrong yet. There was no single moment where I thought, I'm being disrespected. The environment was polite, professional, even friendly. That's what made it so easy to stay. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption that you'll stay late without being asked, assumption that you'll clean up quietly, assumption that you don't need acknowledgement because you're above that. I didn't see myself as a victim. I saw myself as someone playing the long game. I believe loyalty accumulated value, even if it wasn't immediately visible. I believe patience would eventually be recognized as strength. And I believe that staying calm, reasonable, and cooperative was always the right move. At that stage, I still believed the system was fair, just slow. What I didn't realize was that systems don't reward what they don't feel. And because my work prevented problems rather than creating spectacles, it never created emotional urgency around me. I wasn't the hero, I wasn't the problem, I was the buffer. And buffers are rarely celebrated. They're only noticed when they're gone. But at the time, I didn't know that yet. I just knew that I was trusted, with work, with responsibility, with fixing things that mattered. And I mistook that trust for respect. The first moment didn't look important. That's why it stayed with me. It happened during a routine review meeting, one of those weekly check-ins where numbers are scanned, issues are flagged, and everyone pretends the timeline hasn't already slipped. I had spent the previous 2 weeks untangling a billing inconsistency that had been quietly bleeding money. Nothing dramatic, just small errors compounding over time. I came prepared. Not with slides, just notes. Clear figures. A short explanation of what caused the issue, how I fixed it, and what we needed to prevent it from happening again. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I always did. I explained the problem. I explained the fix. I mentioned the estimated savings, just under $50,000 annually if the changes held. There was a pause. Not the kind that signals appreciation, the kind that signals inconvenience. My manager nodded once, glanced at the agenda, and said, "Okay, let's keep moving." That was it. No follow-up questions, no acknowledgement of the impact, no curiosity, just a transition to the next topic, as if I'd reported a printer issue. At the time, I told myself it wasn't personal. Meetings were packed. Everyone was busy. Results mattered more than recognition, right? Still, something in me registered the moment, not emotionally, mentally, like a note filed away without a label. Later that day, someone else referenced the fix casually in a different conversation. Not by name, Just ops clean that up. The wording was neutral, almost kind, but it erased the human element completely. Again, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't doing the work to be applauded. I didn't want to become someone who needed constant validation. But here's what I didn't admit at the time. Acknowledgement isn't about ego, it's about orientation. It tells you where you stand. That was the first small cut. Not enough to hurt, just enough to be felt. After that, similar moments began to appear. Not constantly, just often enough to form a pattern if you were paying attention. Ideas I raised would resurface later, reframed, detached from their source. Decisions would be made that contradicted warnings I'd already given, quietly, then corrected later without comment. Each time I responded the same way: calm, professional, understanding. I didn't interrupt to clarify ownership. I didn't push back. I didn't make it awkward. I thought I was choosing maturity. What I was really choosing was invisibility. The company had an unspoken culture around contribution. Loud inputs were memorable. Confident assertions were rewarded. Preventative work, work that stopped problems before they became crises, was quietly absorbed into the system. And because I operated almost entirely in that preventative space, my value was measured by the absence of disaster, which is a difficult thing to celebrate. Still, I stayed. I leaned in harder. I told myself that consistency builds trust, and trust builds opportunity. That's what loyalty sounded like to me back then. I didn't confront anyone about those moments, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to misinterpret them. I gave the benefit of the doubt generously. Too generously, as it turned out. What made that first small cut important wasn't the meeting itself. It was the internal response. I noticed that I'd started tracking things differently. Not formally, just mentally. I remembered who spoke up and who was credited. I remembered what was acknowledged and what was assumed. I remembered how easily impact could be separated from the person who created it. I didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. Not outwardly, not behaviorally, internally. The loyalty was still there. The effort didn't change. But a quiet awareness had begun to form. One that would eventually change how I interpreted everything that followed. At the time, though, I still believed this was a one-off. A misunderstanding, a normal corporate oversight. I hadn't yet accepted that small cuts are rarely accidental. They're usually tests. Once you notice a pattern, you have two options. You can confront it, or you can explain it away. I chose the second, and I was very good at it. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic changed. That's what made it easy to normalize. The environment stayed polite. People still smiled. My manager still trusted me with sensitive tasks. On the surface, everything looked stable. But the dismissals became more frequent. Not blatant, subtle, strategic almost. I would raise a concern early about a vendor, a workflow, a compliance risk. It would be acknowledged with a nod and a "let's revisit later." Weeks later, when the issue escalated, leadership would scramble, and someone else would be tasked with fixing it. Often, I'd still be the one doing the actual work, just without context or voice. I told myself that was fine. That execution mattered more than authorship. That belief became my shield. When my workload increased without a corresponding change in role or authority, I called it trust. When expectations expanded without conversation, I called it growth. When others received visibility for outcomes I had shaped, I called it team success. Every rationalization helped me avoid one uncomfortable thought, that my silence was being interpreted not as professionalism, but as permission. I watched others learn a different lesson. They spoke before they were certain. They framed ideas with confidence, even when the details were thin. They repeated themselves. They followed up. They made sure their names stayed attached to outcomes. I didn't resent them. I just assumed their approach wasn't for me. I'm not built like that, I told myself. I don't need to play politics. The work will speak eventually. That word eventually carried me longer than it should have. There were moments when the imbalance became obvious. like when a junior colleague was praised publicly for streamlining operations, using a process map I'd built months earlier. Or when a director questioned why an issue hadn't been flagged sooner, an issue I'd flagged in writing, quietly, and been told not to worry about. Each time I paused before responding, and each time I chose restraint. I worried about being seen as defensive. I worried about disrupting the team dynamic. I worried that asserting myself would make me look petty. What I didn't worry about enough was what repeated restraint was doing to my sense of self. The more I stayed quiet, the more the role solidified. Ethan handles the unglamorous work. Ethan doesn't need acknowledgement. Ethan will adapt. It wasn't malicious. That's important. No one sat in a room plotting to minimize me. The system simply optimized around my behavior. And my behavior said, you can take from here without resistance. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through hostility, but through habit. There was a particular afternoon I remember clearly. I was walking back from a meeting where decisions had been made that directly contradicted data I'd shared earlier that week. No one mentioned it. No one asked me to weigh in. As I sat back down at my desk, I felt a brief flicker of something I hadn't felt before. Not anger, resignation. That scared me more. Because resignation isn't loud. It doesn't demand action. It just quietly lowers expectations, first of others, then of yourself. Still, I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt like overreacting. I stayed because nothing had crossed an obvious line. I stayed because I had responsibilities, stability, and a reputation for being steady. And I stayed because part of me still believed that if I just kept showing up the same way, the system would eventually correct itself. That belief wasn't noble. It was comfortable. It allowed me to avoid a harder question: what if this is working exactly as intended? By normalizing the small dismissals, I trained myself to accept a role that required a lot from me and offered very little in return, emotionally, professionally, or ethically. I didn't feel abused. I felt used, but quietly, reasonably, respectfully. And because there was no obvious villain, no dramatic injustice, I kept telling myself it wasn't real enough to act on. That was my mistake. Disrespect doesn't need to be loud to be real. It just needs to be consistent. And by the end of that period, consistency was exactly what it had become. At some point, you stop wondering how people see you because their behavior makes it clear. By then, I wasn't just part of the system. I was a function inside it. When something broke, my name came up immediately. Not in meetings, privately. Quiet messages, side conversations. Can you take a look at this? Can you help smooth this out? We need this fixed, but let's keep it low profile. Low profile. That phrase followed me everywhere. It meant urgency without visibility, responsibility without authority, expectation without protection. I had become the person you relied on when you didn't want attention drawn to a problem. The person who could be trusted not to escalate, not to panic, not to ask uncomfortable questions in public. At first, that felt like trust. Later, it felt like containment. I realized the role I'd been assigned during a planning session that I wasn't technically part of. I was invited at the last minute, sat near the end of the table, and listened as leadership discussed capacity constraints I'd been managing quietly for months. At one point, someone said, "Ethan will figure it out." No discussion, no check-in, no glance in my direction. Just an assumption. Everyone nodded and moved on. That was the moment it clicked. I wasn't being included because my perspective was valued. I was being included because my labor was predictable, reliable, useful, invisible. That was the box. And once you're in it, everything you do reinforces it, especially if you're good at your job. I had internalized the idea that being indispensable was a form of security, that if too much depended on me, I'd always have leverage. What I didn't see was that indispensability without visibility doesn't create power. It creates dependency. On their terms, not yours. They depended on me to absorb risk, to correct mistakes, to carry institutional knowledge without documenting it publicly. And I depended on the belief that this would eventually be rewarded. It never occurred to me that the system might prefer it this way. There was no incentive for anyone to elevate me. If they did, the buffer would disappear. The quiet fixes would become visible problems again. Promoting me would mean replacing me, and replacing someone like me is difficult. So instead, the role calcified. I was consulted after decisions, not before. I was thanked privately, not publicly. I was trusted with outcomes, not influence. I didn't push back because the role came with a kind of comfort. I knew what was expected of me. I was good at it, and stepping outside, it felt risky. But comfort has a cost. The cost was the agency. I noticed that my calendar was filling up with meetings where I was there to support, not to shape. That my feedback was filtered through others. That my name was attached to accountability but rarely to credit. And still, I stayed calm, professional, helpful, because that's what the role required. The danger of roles like this isn't that they're abusive, it's that they're stable. They don't provoke urgency, they don't force change, they just slowly narrow the range of who you're allowed to be. I wasn't frustrated enough to leave. I wasn't angry enough to confront. I was just fixed in place. Looking back, I can see how clearly the role was defined by everyone except me. They knew exactly what to expect. They knew what they could ask for. And they knew what they didn't have to give in return. The only person still confused was me. I still believed that staying steady was a strength. Refusing to politicize myself was integrity. That loyalty was something you proved by enduring discomfort quietly. I didn't realize that endurance, when unacknowledged, stops being a virtue and starts becoming consent. The role I was assigned wasn't cruel. It was efficient. And that made it far more dangerous. The day something shifted didn't come with tension or raised voices. There was no argument, no breaking point anyone else could point to later and say, that's when things changed. It was an ordinary morning. I was early, like usual. The office was quiet, lights half dimmed, the kind of calm that only exists before emails start arriving. I was reviewing a routine report when I noticed an anomaly. Small at first, but familiar enough to make me pause. I followed it. 30 minutes later, I realized it wasn't routine at all. A vendor billing structure had changed quietly months earlier. The terms had been adjusted in a way that shifted liability onto us under specific conditions. Conditions that weren't rare. Conditions that had already occurred twice, unnoticed. I did the math carefully. Twice more, and the exposure would cross 6 figures. I documented everything, dates, versions, email trails. I didn't panic. I didn't escalate immediately. I just made sure I understood it completely. By mid-morning, I knew what needed to be done. A small change, a renegotiation clause triggered. A compliance flag was raised quietly before finance closed the quarter. I brought it to my manager, calmly, clearly, with evidence. He listened, nodded, asked a few questions. Then he said, let's not make this a big deal yet. I'll handle it. That phrase again. I'll handle it. 2 weeks passed. Nothing happened. The risk remained. The window narrowed. I followed up once, politely. I was told it was on the radar. I followed up again. I was told not to worry, so I handled it. I contacted legal. I looped in procurement. I framed it as a clarification request, not a complaint. Within a week, the contract language was amended. The liability exposure was removed retroactively. The projected savings, just over $300,000 across the year, were confirmed by finance. No alarms, no announcements, just prevention. That's when the meeting happened. I was called in the following week, not to thank me, not to debrief, to align expectations. The message was delivered calmly, professionally, almost gently. I was told I had overstepped, that I should have waited, that involving other departments without explicit approval created unnecessary visibility. While the outcome was positive, the process was a concern. Then came the word I hadn't expected. Warning. Not formal on paper, but clear enough. A line had been drawn. As I listened, I felt something settle, not in my chest, but in my mind. A clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. The issue wasn't the warning, the issue was the framework. I had protected the company had protected the hierarchy. And in that equation, my judgment didn't matter, only my obedience. I nodded. I acknowledged the feedback. I thanked them for the clarity. And as I walked back to my desk, I realized something important. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about alignment. Up until that moment, I had believed that doing the right thing would eventually place me on the right side of the system. That integrity was its own leverage. That morning, I rewrote that belief, not emotionally, structurally. I saw the shape of the system clearly for the first time. What it rewarded, what discouraged, where I sat within it. And I understood that if I continued operating the same way, the outcome wouldn't change. The shift wasn't anger, it was acceptance. And acceptance, I would learn, is the beginning of very different decisions. After the warning, nothing changed on the surface. That was the first thing I noticed. No tension, no distance. My manager still greeted me the same way. Meetings ran as usual. My workload didn't decrease. If anything, it increased slightly, as if to test whether the boundary they'd drawn had landed. It had, just not in the way they expected. Before, my silence had been reflexive, automatic, a byproduct of wanting to be easy to work with. After that meeting, silence became deliberate. I stopped offering early warnings in group settings, not out of spite, but because I now understood how early warnings were treated. They weren't seen as insight. They were seen as interruptions. So I waited. When I noticed issues forming, I documented them privately. Dates, dependencies, impact. I didn't escalate. I didn't remember. I didn't insist. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. People mistook my quiet for acceptance. They assumed I'd internalized the feedback and adjusted accordingly. In a way, they were right. I had adjusted. I had, just not toward obedience. I stopped filling gaps that weren't assigned to me. If a process broke outside my scope, I let it surface naturally. If a decision ignored data I previously shared, I let the consequences play out at a low, manageable level. Not catastrophically, not maliciously, just honestly. This wasn't sabotage, it was alignment. I was still doing my job, I was just no longer protecting the system from its own blind spots for free. The interesting thing was how quickly people noticed the absence, without realizing what it meant. Small delays appeared, questions went unanswered longer. Issues that used to be resolved quietly now require meetings. Visibility increased, and with visibility came discomfort. I stayed calm. I responded when asked. I never said, "I warned you." I never referenced past decisions. I simply worked within the boundaries that had been clarified for me. That was the quiet dominance, not pushing, not reacting, just allowing reality to become visible. Internally, I felt something unfamiliar, control, not over others, but over myself. I no longer felt the need to prove my value. I didn't chase acknowledgement. I didn't rush to fix what wasn't mine. I conserved energy, I observed, and I learned. I learned who panicked when problems surfaced, who deflected, who sought cover, who needed buffers more than they admitted. I also learned how much institutional knowledge I carried and how little of it was documented anywhere else. That realization wasn't empowering in an ego-driven way. It was sobering, because it meant that for years, the company hadn't invested in redundancy or transparency. They'd invested in me, quietly and formally without accountability. And now, after the warning, I understood the unspoken expectation. Continue to carry that load, but stay in your lane. I had no intention of breaking rules or causing harm. But I also had no intention of continuing to subsidize dysfunction with my silence. So I chose restraint. Strategic restraint. I spoke less in meetings, but when I did, it was precise. Measured, difficult to ignore. I asked questions instead of offering fixes. I let others commit to decisions publicly. Silence, when chosen consciously, changes its meaning. Before, it said, "I don't want trouble." Now it said, "I'm paying attention." They mistook the difference. That mistake would matter later. While things appeared stable, I was building something quietly. Not a plan for revenge, not an exit strategy, at least not yet. What I was doing was understanding the full shape of the machine I was inside. I started by mapping processes more thoroughly than I ever had before. Not just how things were supposed to work, but how they actually worked. Where approvals were assumed instead of documented, where decisions were made verbally and never recorded. Compliance relied on memory rather than systems. I already knew most of this. The difference now was intention. I stopped assuming someone else would eventually formalize it. I wrote it down, carefully, objectively, without commentary. I documented the workflows that only functioned because I was there to nudge them back on track. I tracked how often I was looped in after the fact. I noted which issues were recurring and which ones were merely patched. None of this raised alarms because none of it was new behavior on the surface. I'd always been detail-oriented. I'd always taken notes. The black notebook on my desk didn't attract attention any more than it ever had. What changed was how I used it. I also began paying closer attention to contracts, obligations, and dependencies. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for fragility. Points where the company relied on unwritten knowledge or informal trust to remain compliant and efficient. There were more than I expected. In parallel, I cleaned up my own trail. I made sure my contributions were documented in neutral language. I clarified ownership in writing where possible without drawing attention. I saved emails, not obsessively, selectively. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. I noticed something else during this period. People had stopped asking me for my opinion in advance. They came to me when things went wrong. That told me everything. I became fluent in the organization's blind spots. I knew which numbers were trusted without verification, which reports were skimmed, which approvals were rubber-stamped. And I knew exactly how much money was being saved or risk avoided by quiet interventions that no one tracked. The most interesting part wasn't the leverage itself. It was how invisible it was to everyone else. Leadership believed stability was the default state. They didn't see the small corrections, the silent adjustments, the preventative decisions that kept things from escalating. They assumed the system worked because it always had. They didn't realize that the system worked because someone was constantly choosing to make it work. That someone was me. And now, after the warning, I understood that my role wasn't to hold the system together indefinitely. It was to operate within it clearly, ethically, and with eyes open. So I prepared. I learned the language of risk instead of the language of effort. I reframed contributions in terms of exposure, liability, and continuity. I aligned my thinking with how decisions were actually made, not how they were described. And I waited, not for failure, for inevitability. Because systems built on unacknowledged labor always reveal themselves eventually, all you have to do is stop compensating for them. They never noticed the shift because it didn't look like movement. It looked like stability. But under the surface, I was positioning myself quietly, deliberately, for a moment when clarity would no longer be optional. That moment was closer than they thought. The reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no surge of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. When it finally happened, it felt almost disappointingly calm, like confirming something I'd already known but hadn't allowed myself to name. I was reviewing a quarterly operations summary late one evening. Not because I was behind, because I wanted to see how the story was being told without me in the room. Which metrics were highlighted? Which risks were softened? Which efficiencies were presented as organic improvements rather than deliberate interventions? That's when I saw it clearly. Several of the company's most stable performance indicators were directly tied to processes I maintained, processes that weren't formally owned, documented, or audited. They existed in a gray zone, critical enough to matter, informal enough to be invisible. If those processes slowed even slightly, the impact wouldn't be catastrophic, but it would be noticeable. Costs would rise, timelines would slip, questions would start being asked, and no one would immediately know where to look. That was the leverage, not power over people, power over outcomes. What struck me wasn't the opportunity, it was the responsibility. I hadn't created this situation intentionally. It had emerged because I'd been allowed, even encouraged, to operate outside formal boundaries for years. The warning hadn't corrected that. It had merely clarified that the company wanted the benefits without the accountability. I sat there for a long time after that realization, not plotting, not strategizing, just acknowledging what was true. If I continued as I had before, nothing would change. If I escalated aggressively, I'd be framed as disruptive. If I left immediately, the narrative would be simplified and my contributions erased. There was only one option that aligned with my values: act in a way that was transparent, ethical, and irreversible, but not loud. I didn't want recognition anymore. I wanted alignment. The private reveal wasn't about discovering my importance. It was about understanding the system's dependence and deciding how much of myself I was willing to continue giving to it. That night, I closed the report, shut down my computer, and went home earlier than usual. Not because I was done, but because I finally knew what I was doing next. Once you see clearly, you don't get to pretend anymore. That was the hardest part. After the private reveal, I spent several days doing nothing differently on the outside. Same hours, same tone, same responsiveness. But internally, I was weighing options, real ones, not fantasies. I could speak up formally, request a role clarification, push for recognition or authority to match responsibility. That path was familiar, encouraged even, in theory, but I knew how it would play out. Best case, I'd get a polite acknowledgement and a slow, conditional adjustment. Worst case, I'd be labeled difficult, someone suddenly focused on titles. I could leave quietly, find another role, take my experience elsewhere. That option tempted me more than I expected. Clean break, no conflict, no explanations. But leaving immediately would preserve the illusion that everything had been fine. The system would frame my departure as normal attrition. My work would be redistributed without context. The lessons would be missed entirely. I could also stay exactly as I was, continue absorbing risk, fixing issues, protecting outcomes. That option required the least disruption, and it costs the most, because it meant accepting that my judgment would never be trusted, only used, that my loyalty would always be transactional, and the terms would never be renegotiated. There was a fourth option. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve ultimatums or threats. It simply required me to stop acting as an unofficial safeguard, to move fully into the role I'd been assigned and no further. That option was irreversible. Once I stopped compensating for gaps that weren't mine to own, the system would have to respond. Not emotionally, operationally. I didn't make the decision in a moment of frustration. I made it after reviewing my notes, my documentation, and my own boundaries. I asked myself one question: if nothing changed after the warning, what makes me think anything will change now, unless the cost becomes visible? That question settled it. I chose the option that aligned my actions with the expectations that had been set for me. No more, no less. I wouldn't withhold information. I wouldn't create problems. I wouldn't violate trust. I would simply stop donating extra labor to a system that had explicitly told me not to step outside my lane. That decision felt quiet, almost boring, but I knew it would ripple. Because systems don't react to intentions. They react to consequences. And once I stepped back into formal alignment, those consequences were no longer mine to absorb. After the decision, I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't distance myself emotionally. I didn't start counting days or acting detached. From the outside, I was exactly the same person I'd always been. That was intentional. I continued to meet deadlines. I responded to messages promptly. I attended meetings and contributed when asked. I didn't withhold information or let things fail dramatically. What I stopped doing was absorbing responsibility that wasn't formally mine. If a process lacked ownership, I didn't assume it. If a decision required sign-off, I waited for it. If a risk existed outside my scope, I documented it and moved on. Everything I did was traceable, defensible, boring. That's what made it effective. I began routing questions back to their owners, politely, in writing. I clarified assumptions before acting. I asked for confirmation instead of improvising. Each step slowed things just enough to reveal how much had previously relied on informal intervention. No one objected, not at first. Why would they? I wasn't breaking rules. I was following them more closely than ever. Behind the scenes, I ensured that all documentation was up to date and accessible. Not hidden, not weaponized, just complete. This wasn't about creating chaos. It was about removing myself as a silent stabilizer. The shift was subtle. A report took longer to finalize because it needed an approval that used to be implied. A vendor issue escalated because no one owned the follow-up. A meeting had to be scheduled because an assumption was challenged. Each instance was minor on its own. Together, they added friction. And friction creates visibility. Still, no one connected it to me. Why would they? I hadn't announced anything. I hadn't complained. I hadn't drawn lines publicly. I was simply operating within the boundaries that had been reinforced after the warning. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no adrenaline, no sense of rebellion, just steadiness. For the first time in a long while, my actions and my values were aligned. I wasn't being disloyal. I wasn't being passive-aggressive. I was being accurate. Accuracy has weight, and as the weeks passed, that weight began to be felt. Not by me, but by the system that had grown accustomed to my quiet corrections. The consequences were beginning. The first signs weren't dramatic, no emergency meetings, no urgent emails with my name on them. Just a subtle shift in tone, confusion where there had once been certainty. Questions started circling without landing. Tasks stalled in ways they hadn't before. People followed up more often, not with urgency, but with uncertainty. Do we have confirmation on this? Who's owning that piece? Did this get approved? These were questions I'd quietly answered for years without being asked. Now they hung in the air. At first, leadership assumed it was temporary. A busy quarter, a rough patch. Someone joked about growing pains. I listened, I took notes, I responded when asked. I didn't step in early. That was the difference. Finance flagged a variance that used to resolve itself before reports were finalized. Operations escalated a vendor issue that had been handled in the past. Legal asked why a certain review cycle had been missed, something I'd previously caught and corrected upstream. None of these issues was catastrophic, but each one consumed time, attention, and emotional energy. And none of them pointed clearly to a cause. People began looking at each other. Meetings multiplied. Email threads grew longer. Decisions slowed. Still, no one blamed me. Why would they? I was present, responsive, calm. From their perspective, I was doing my job. What they were feeling wasn't my absence. It was the absence of buffer. Buffers are invisible until they're gone. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, but with confirmation. This wasn't personal. It was structural. The system had relied on informal labor to function smoothly, and now that labor was no longer subsidizing its inefficiencies. What struck me was how quickly stress surfaced elsewhere. Managers grew sharper. Deadlines felt tighter. Small issues were treated as signals of larger instability. The mood shifted, not toward panic, but toward unease. People sensed something was off, they just couldn't name it. I stayed grounded. When asked why something hadn't been flagged earlier, I referenced documentation. When pressed for solutions, I outlined options without committing to execution unless it was within my role. When decisions were made without input, I respected them. Every interaction was clean, and that cleanliness made the contrast unavoidable. Within a month, someone asked me, half-jokingly, "Have you been doing less lately?" I smiled and said, "I've been doing exactly what's assigned." That answer lingered longer than I expected. Because it raised a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If this is exactly what's assigned, then what was I doing before? The consequences weren't loud. They were cumulative. And once accumulation reaches a certain point, attention follows. By the time leadership realized something was wrong, the shape of the problem was already distorted. They didn't see a single failure. They saw symptoms, missed handoffs, duplicated efforts, decisions revisited too late. Each issue looked small enough to fix on its own. Together, they pointed to something deeper, but no one could agree on what that was. That's when urgency crept in. Not clarity, urgency. Meetings were called with less notice. Agendas grew vague. Words like alignment and ownership started appearing more often, usually without definition. People began asking for status updates that didn't exist in a clean form because they'd never needed to before. I noticed the shift in how people spoke to me, less casual, more careful. Questions were framed as hypotheticals. If someone were overseeing this, what would they need? Or, historically, how has this been managed? The language avoided naming responsibility directly, as if saying it out loud might make the gap undeniable. I answered honestly, neutrally. I didn't volunteer to take things back on. I didn't position myself as a solution. I simply described how things worked and how they currently didn't. That's when regret began to surface. Not an apology, regret. Someone mentioned that maybe roles hadn't been clearly defined. Another suggested that perhaps some contributions had gone undercommunicated. These statements floated in the room unclaimed. They weren't invitations to change. They were attempts to soften reality. Behind closed doors, I could sense the scramble. Requests came in sideways. Can you just sanity check this? Can you take a quick look? We're a bit stuck. Each time I asked the same question. Who's owning it? Sometimes there was an answer, sometimes there wasn't. When there wasn't, I declined politely. That was when the panic sharpened. Because now the cost wasn't just operational, it was reputational. Things that had always just worked were being noticed by people higher up the chain, and those people wanted explanations. Explanations require names. That's when someone finally tried to rewind. A conversation was scheduled, framed as a reset, a chance to clear the air. The tone was warmer than it had been in months, almost conciliatory. But it was too late, not because I was angry, because the moment for informal correction had passed. Systems can't be patched with sentiment once consequences are visible. At that point, any attempt to restore the old dynamic looks like fear, not respect. I listened, I acknowledged, I didn't argue, and I didn't step back into the role I'd outgrown. Because by then it was clear they weren't trying to fix the system. They were trying to put the buffer back. The conversation wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no accusations. If someone had overheard it, they might have assumed it was a routine check-in. That was the point. We sat in a small conference room, glass walls, neutral lighting, my manager and one director, both composed, both careful. They started by acknowledging my consistency, my institutional knowledge, how much they valued my contributions. I listened without reacting. Then came the shift. They asked if I'd noticed the recent challenges, if I had any thoughts on why things felt less smooth, whether there was something I'd been doing differently. The question was framed gently, but it was a test. I answered honestly. I said that after the warning, I'd taken the feedback seriously, that I'd adjusted my behavior to operate strictly within my defined responsibilities, that I'd stopped making assumptions about ownership or authority. I didn't blame anyone. I didn't reference the savings. I didn't list what I used to do. I simply described alignment. The room went quiet, not awkwardly, but heavily. The director asked if I felt restricted. I said no. I said I felt clear. That word changed the temperature. They asked what I would need to feel empowered again. I paused before answering, not for effect, but because the answer mattered. I said I didn't want to go back to informal expectations. If my role involved safeguarding critical processes, it needed to be defined, resourced, and recognized accordingly. Publicly, structurally. Otherwise, I was comfortable continuing as I was. No ultimatum, no threat, just a boundary. They exchanged a glance. I didn't feel the silence. That was the confrontation. Not heat, not emotion, just contrast. They saw, in that moment, that the person they'd quietly relied on was no longer available in the same way. Not because he was leaving, but because he had stopped compensating. They thanked me for my candor, said they'd take it back and discuss. I nodded. I meant it. And as I left the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, relief. I didn't walk out of that meeting feeling triumphant. There was no sense that I'd won anything. What I felt instead was grounded, like I'd finally stopped standing on shifting ground. In the weeks that followed, some things changed. Others didn't. Leadership took longer to respond than I expected. Not out of indifference, but because restructuring reality takes more effort than ignoring it. Roles were reviewed, ownership was discussed, certain responsibilities were redistributed, not perfectly, but deliberately. I remained where I was. That surprised some people. They expected me to leverage the moment into a promotion, or to quietly exit if I didn't get one. But that wasn't the point. The point had never been advancement. It was integrity. I continued doing my work, now clearly defined. I no longer carried invisible weight. I no longer filled gaps that no one acknowledged. When something wasn't mine, it wasn't mine. And for the first time in a long while, that felt light. I noticed a change in how people interacted with me. Not more admiration, more precision. They asked clearer questions. They documented decisions. They followed up properly. Respect didn't arrive as praise. It arrived as a structure. I also noticed a change in myself. I didn't need to prove reliability anymore. I didn't need to anticipate needs that weren't expressed. I stopped measuring my worth by how much friction I could absorb. Loyalty, I learned, isn't about endurance. It's about consent. And I had withdrawn mine from anything that required me to disappear. I'm still calm, still measured, still quiet. But I'm no longer invisible. Because invisibility isn't humility, it's erasure. Who I am now isn't someone who withholds or retaliates. I don't operate from resentment. I operate from alignment. I give what's asked, I own what's defined, and I protect my boundaries without apology. The company didn't become perfect, neither did I, but the relationship became honest. And that, I've learned, is the only foundation worth standing on. Looking back, the most important moment in this story wasn't the warning. It wasn't the savings, and it wasn't the conversation in the glass-walled room. It was the moment I realized that loyalty, when unexamined, can quietly turn into self-erasure. For a long time, I believed loyalty meant staying, absorbing discomfort, protecting the system even when the system didn't protect you back. I told myself that was maturity. That was professionalism. That was a strength. But loyalty without boundaries isn't a virtue. It's silence mistaken for consent. The company didn't set out to punish loyalty. They simply optimized around it. Systems do that. They reward what reduces friction and penalize what introduces it, even when that friction is necessary for honesty. When I saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, I thought I was proving my value. What I was actually doing was confirming a role they were comfortable with. The warning didn't make me stop caring, it made me stop disappearing, and that's an important distinction. I didn't become colder. I didn't become manipulative. I didn't burn bridges or humiliate anyone. I didn't even demand justice. I demanded alignment. I learned that silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen. That being dependable doesn't require being invisible. And that respect rarely arrives through endurance alone. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do is stop giving more than you're asked, especially when what you're asked to give keeps expanding without acknowledgement. If this story resonates, it might not be because of the numbers or the outcome. It might be because you felt that quiet imbalance, the one that doesn't explode, but slowly drains something essential. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever stayed loyal to a role, a job, or a relationship, not because it was fair, but because leaving felt like betraying who you thought you were? Sometimes growth doesn't look like leaving. Sometimes it looks like finally standing where you already are and refusing to disappear.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ